Healing rarely begins with answers. It begins when the need to explain dissolves. Carl Jung understood that the psyche heals not through constant narration, but through inner alignment. For a long time, people try to heal by explaining themselves. They justify their pain. They seek understanding from others. They replay conversations, hoping clarity will bring relief. But clarity does not come from being understood. It comes from being honest with oneself. Jung believed that excessive explanation is often a defense, a way to stay connected to the wound without truly entering it. Words become a substitute for feeling. Healing begins the moment a person stops asking, "Do they understand me?" and starts asking, "Am I listening to myself?" Silence is not withdrawal. It is recalibration. In silence, the psyche reorganizes. Emotions that were suppressed begin to surface. Not dramatically, but steadily. This is why early healing feels empty, unremarkable, almost invisible. There is no sudden relief, no external validation, just a quiet decision. I no longer need to explain why I choose myself. Choosing yourself does not mean rejecting others. It means ending self-betrayal. Jung saw self-betrayal as the root of many neuroses. Each time a person acts against their inner truth, the psyche records it. Over time, these betrayals accumulate. They manifest as anxiety, exhaustion, resentment. Healing begins when these patterns are interrupted. Not with confrontation, not with explanation, but with withdrawal of energy. The person stops proving, stops defending, stops over-communicating, and something subtle shifts. Without constant explanation, the psyche feels safer, less exposed, less fragmented. Energy returns inward. This inward movement can feel uncomfortable, lonely, even selfish. But Jung emphasized that individuation often requires temporary separation from collective expectations. You cannot heal while constantly justifying your existence. When you choose yourself, you stop negotiating your worth. You stop waiting for permission to feel what you feel. And in that stillness, healing begins, not loudly, but truthfully. As the need to explain fades, another realization quietly appears. Much of the suffering was not caused by what happened, but by the effort to make it acceptable to others. Jung observed that the psyche becomes exhausted when it constantly seeks external agreement for its inner truth. The self is divided. One part feels, another part edits. Healing begins when this division softens. Silence allows the feeling to exist without correction, without justification, without strategy. This is why silence can feel unsettling at first. There is no audience, no narrative control, no reassurance, only direct contact with what is present. In this space, the person starts to sense how often they abandoned themselves in order to maintain harmony, how often they minimized their needs to avoid discomfort in others. These insights do not arrive as accusations. They arrive as recognition. And recognition is gentle. Jung believed that what is truly seen no longer needs to be repeated as a symptom. As self-betrayal becomes conscious, the psyche no longer has to express it through tension, through anxiety, through emotional fatigue. The person begins to set boundaries, without announcing them, not as declarations, but as quiet choices. They stop answering immediately. They stop overextending. They stop correcting misunderstandings. That costs too much energy. This is not withdrawal from life. It is withdrawal from patterns that drained vitality. Energy, once scattered, starts to gather. With this gathered energy, a new kind of clarity forms. Not intellectual clarity, but bodily clarity. The body relaxes in certain decisions and tightens in others. Jung considered this somatic response, a form of unconscious wisdom. When a person learns to trust this signal, they stop needing explanations. The body already knows. As this trust deepens, relationships naturally reorganize. Some connections soften, others fall away. not because of conflict, but because they were sustained by explanation, not by resonance. Healing does not repair everything. It simplifies. It removes what required constant effort to maintain. And in that simplification, the person discovers a steadier ground. They begin to act less from fear of loss, and more from alignment. This alignment does not make life painless, but it makes pain honest. There is no longer the additional suffering of pretending, and in that honesty, something inside begins to rest. A quiet rest, not yet celebratory, but deeply stabilizing. From here, the psyche continues its work, slowly, silently, without asking to be witnessed. As this inner rest deepens, the person begins to notice a subtle shift in how time is experienced. Moments no longer rush past with the same urgency. There is less pressure to respond, to decide, to resolve. Jung spoke of this as a return to psychological rhythm. When the psyche is no longer fragmented, time becomes less oppressive. The person no longer measures progress by visible outcomes, but by inner congruence. They may appear quieter to others, less reactive, less available, but internally there is more space. This space allows emotions to move, without being dramatized or suppressed. Sadness comes and goes. Anger arises and dissolves. Joy appears without being grasped. None of these states define the person anymore. They are experiences, not identities. Jung emphasized that healing is not about becoming happy, but about becoming whole. Wholeness includes contradictions, strength and fragility, clarity and uncertainty. In silence, these opposites begin to coexist. The person no longer tries to resolve every inner tension. They learn to hold it. Holding tension without immediate action is one of the psyche's most mature capacities. From this holding, discernment emerges. Choices become simpler, even when they are difficult, not because there are fewer consequences, but because there is less inner conflict. The person stops asking, "What will they think?" and starts sensing, "Can I live with this choice?" This question becomes the compass. Jung believed that when decisions are made from this place, the psyche supports them, even when the external world resists. Resistance no longer feels like proof of error. It becomes part of the path. The need to convince fades. The need to be seen fades. What remains is a quiet commitment to one's own inner coherence. This commitment does not isolate the person from life. It changes how they participate in it. They engage without overextension. They care without self-erasure. They speak when necessary, and remain silent when silence protects truth. Healing, in this sense, is not a destination. It is a way of relating to oneself that continues to unfold, moment by moment, beneath the surface of ordinary life. As this way of relating to oneself stabilizes, something unexpected occurs. The person becomes less afraid of being misunderstood. Jung noted that the fear of misunderstanding often masks a deeper fear, the fear of standing alone with one's truth. When explanations are released, misunderstanding becomes tolerable, not because it no longer hurts, but because it no longer defines. The person begins to see that being misunderstood is not always a failure of communication. Sometimes it is a sign of differentiation. Different levels of consciousness do not always translate easily. This realization brings a quiet freedom. The person no longer shapes their inner life to fit external expectations. They stop adjusting their tone, their feelings, their boundaries, to preserve an image. Jung believed that authenticity emerges when the ego stops negotiating with the collective. This does not create isolation. It creates integrity. From this place, relationships change texture. Conversations become simpler. There is less explaining, less defending, less proving. What is shared is what is real, not what is persuasive. Some people feel closer in this atmosphere. Others drift away. Neither outcome is forced. Healing does not cling. It allows movement. The person also becomes more patient with others, not because they excuse harmful behavior, but because they no longer need others to be different in order to remain whole. This patience is not resignation. It is groundedness. Jung spoke of this as the ego learning to trust the self. When this trust forms, life feels less personal. Events are no longer interpreted solely as attacks or rewards. They are experiences with symbolic weight. The psyche asks not, "Why is this happening to me?" but, "What is being revealed here?" This question changes everything. It opens curiosity where there was fear. It opens reflection where there was reaction. And slowly, the person notices that healing has been happening all along, not as a dramatic breakthrough, but as a steady reorientation. They are no longer trying to become someone else. They are learning to inhabit who they already are. This inhabiting brings a calm confidence. Not loud, not performative, but reliable. The kind of confidence that does not need to be explained, because it is felt. And from this felt place, life continues to unfold with fewer demands, fewer negotiations, and a deeper sense of inner permission to simply be. From this deeper sense of inner permission, the person begins to notice how much effort was once spent resisting their own nature. Traits that were hidden, softened, or overcorrected now emerge without tension. Jung believed that much psychological suffering comes from living one-sidedly. When certain aspects of the psyche are rejected, they do not disappear. They operate in the shadows. Healing brings these aspects into the light, not to glorify them, but to integrate them. The person may discover firmness where there was excessive softness, sensitivity where there was emotional armor, rest where there was constant striving. None of this feels like becoming someone new. It feels like returning. This return is often quiet and unspectacular. There is no announcement, no dramatic shift in identity, but daily life subtly changes. The person no longer feels compelled to overcommit. They leave conversations before exhaustion sets in. They say no without rehearsing explanations. Jung understood that the psyche restores balance when it is no longer forced to compensate. As balance grows, inner conflict decreases. Thoughts become less circular. Emotions settle more quickly. The nervous system finds a steadier rhythm. This steadiness allows the person to tolerate complexity. They can hold ambivalence without panic. They can remain present in uncertainty. This is not detachment. It is resilience. The person becomes less reactive to external chaos. Because there is less chaos internally to resonate with it. They no longer chase clarity in others' reactions. They trust their own alignment. Jung saw this as a sign that the center of gravity has shifted from the outside to the inside. Life continues to bring challenges. Conflicts still arise. Loss still happens. But these experiences no longer threaten the core. They are felt, processed, and integrated. Healing, in this sense, is not the absence of pain, but the absence of self-abandonment in the face of pain. And as this way of being deepens, the person moves through the world with less urgency to prove, less fear of collapse, and a growing familiarity with their own inner ground. From this ground, choices emerge more naturally, relationships become clearer, and life feels less like something to survive, and more like something to participate in consciously. The process continues, not in dramatic leaps, but in steady, almost invisible adjustments that reshape the inner landscape, from which everything else unfolds. As this inner landscape reshapes itself, the person begins to sense a different relationship with effort. What once required constant force now unfolds with less resistance. Jung described this as alignment between conscious intention and unconscious movement. When these two are at odds, life feels heavy. When they cooperate, even difficulty feels purposeful. The person no longer pushes themselves forward out of fear of falling behind. They move when something feels ripe. This ripeness is not laziness. It is timing. Healing refines the sense of timing. The person notices when engagement nourishes, and when it depletes. They step back sooner. They enter more deliberately. This discernment prevents many wounds that once seemed inevitable. Jung believed that maturity is not measured by intensity, but by appropriateness. Doing the right thing at the right moment, for the right reason. From this place, ambition changes shape. It becomes quieter, less performative. The person may still strive, but not to prove worth. They strive to express something true. Failure, when it happens, no longer attacks identity. It becomes feedback. Success, when it arrives, no longer inflates the ego. It becomes confirmation of alignment. This balance protects the psyche. The person also begins to notice how their inner state influences their surroundings. Without trying to lead or instruct, they create a different atmosphere. People feel less judged around them. Conversations slow down. Silences feel safer. Jung noted that an individuated person does not impose change. They evoke it. This evocation happens naturally. When someone is no longer fragmented inside, the person's presence becomes more consistent, less situational, less dependent on mood or approval. They are not always calm, not always certain, but they are present, and presence has weight. It communicates safety without reassurance, boundaries without rigidity, care without self-sacrifice. From here, healing is no longer something the person works on. It becomes the ground from which they live. Old wounds may still ache occasionally. Memories may resurface, but they no longer pull the person out of themselves. They are held within a larger context of meaning. And within that context, life continues to unfold, not as a problem to solve, but as a dialogue between inner truth and outer experience that remains alive, responsive, and quietly evolving. Within this ongoing dialogue between inner truth and outer experience, the person begins to notice a subtle refinement of intuition, not the dramatic kind that announces itself, but a steady inner sense of direction. Jung understood intuition as a bridge between the conscious mind and the deeper layers of the psyche. When noise recedes, this bridge becomes clearer. The person no longer second-guesses every inner signal. They listen, pause, and respond with greater trust. This does not mean every intuition is acted upon. It means it is respected. There is a difference. Healing teaches discernment, not impulsivity. The person learns to distinguish between fear disguised as intuition, and intuition that feels calm, grounded, and persistent. Fear is urgent. Intuition is steady. This distinction changes decision-making profoundly. Choices are no longer rushed. They are allowed to mature internally, before becoming action. Jung believed that what is rushed in consciousness often returns as complication later. Slowness, in this sense, is not delay. It is integration. As integration deepens, the person becomes more comfortable with not knowing. Uncertainty no longer triggers immediate self-doubt. It becomes a space of listening. The psyche continues to unfold information when it is not pressured. This patience extends outward as well. The person no longer tries to fix others' processes. They allow people to arrive at their own realizations. This does not come from indifference, but from respect for psychological timing. Jung emphasized that insight cannot be forced. It must ripen. From this place, compassion becomes less emotional and more grounded. It is no longer fueled by self-sacrifice, but by understanding. The person can care deeply without losing themselves. They recognize where responsibility ends and where another's journey begins. This clarity protects the inner work. Healing does not expand by absorbing everything. It expands by maintaining shape. Boundaries become less reactive and more structural. They are not walls. They are contours. And within these contours, the psyche continues to grow, organizing itself around a center that feels increasingly familiar. Not because it is perfect, but because it is true. From this truth, life continues to move. Sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully, but always met with a presence that no longer needs to explain itself in order to exist. As this presence stabilizes, the person begins to experience a new relationship with inner conflict. Instead of rushing to resolve it, they stay with it. Jung believed that growth happens not by eliminating opposites, but by allowing them to coexist consciously. The psyche matures when it can hold tension, without collapsing into extremes. The person notices that contradictory feelings can exist at the same time, without canceling each other out. They can feel attachment and independence, care and firmness, desire and restraint. This capacity was once impossible, because the inner structure was too fragile. Now it holds. This holding does not numb emotion. It deepens it. Feelings are no longer overwhelming, because they are no longer resisted. They move through awareness, instead of flooding it. Jung described this as the ego learning to serve the self, rather than dominate it. When this shift occurs, inner dialogue becomes less harsh. The critical voice loses authority, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer believed unquestioningly. Self-compassion arises naturally, not as a technique, but as understanding. The person recognizes that many past choices were made with limited awareness, not failure of character. This recognition dissolves shame, and without shame, the psyche relaxes. From this relaxed state, energy flows more freely. Creativity emerges in unexpected ways, not always as productivity, but as play, curiosity, exploration. The person becomes more interested in experience than in outcome. Jung saw play as a sign of psychic health, a willingness to engage life, without over-identifying with results. This lightness does not trivialize life. It balances its weight. The person still takes responsibility, but without self-punishment. They still care deeply, but without losing center. And as this balance continues to form, life presents new situations that once would have triggered old patterns. Now, these situations are met differently. Not perfectly, but consciously. The reaction may still arise, but it is noticed. And what is noticed no longer governs blindly. This noticing is the quiet revolution of healing. It does not announce itself. It simply changes the way one inhabits each moment. From here, the psyche continues its work. Subtle, intelligent, always adjusting. As the person moves forward, with less inner resistance, and a growing trust in the process unfolding from within. With this growing trust in the inner process, the person begins to sense a quieter kind of strength. Not the strength that resists or dominates, but the strength that endures. Jung understood endurance as a psychological capacity, the ability to remain present with oneself, without needing constant distraction or reassurance. The person no longer feels compelled to escape discomfort immediately. They stay with unease long enough for it to reveal its message. Often, what once felt unbearable turns out to be a signal of transition, an old identity loosening, a former attachment losing relevance, a belief quietly dissolving. These moments are subtle. They rarely come with certainty, but the person senses that something is being shed, without violence. This is how healing continues, not by dramatic release, but by gradual disidentification. The person notices that certain thoughts no longer carry emotional charge. Memories arise, but they do not demand reaction. Jung would say the complex has lost its energy, and when energy is released from old patterns, it becomes available elsewhere. Attention sharpens, listening deepens, presence widens. The person begins to experience moments where nothing is missing, not excitement, not ecstasy, just sufficiency. These moments are easy to overlook, yet they are signs of integration. The psyche is no longer searching compulsively for completion outside itself. From this place, relationships feel different. The person does not cling to connection, nor do they avoid it. They meet others where they are, without the need to be needed. Jung saw this as a shift from symbiosis to relation. Two whole individuals meeting, not two wounds trying to heal each other. This changes the emotional atmosphere of intimacy. There is more honesty, more space, more respect for difference. Disappointment still happens, but it no longer collapses the inner structure. The person can feel sadness without concluding something is wrong with them. This alone marks a profound transformation, because much suffering came not from pain itself, but from the meaning assigned to it. Now, meaning is allowed to emerge. Instead of being imposed, the psyche continues to adjust, to refine, to recalibrate. There is no finish line in sight, only a growing familiarity with the inner ground that remains present through change, loss, growth, and the quiet unfolding of a life lived with increasing truth. As this familiarity with the inner ground deepens, the person begins to relate differently to uncertainty. What once felt threatening now feels spacious. Jung believed that uncertainty is not the enemy of the psyche, but the condition under which transformation becomes possible. When outcomes are not fixed, the unconscious can participate. The person no longer rushes to define what an experience means. They allow it to unfold before naming it. This patience changes perception. Situations are no longer judged immediately as success or failure. They are held as processes. This shift reduces inner pressure. The person notices that many former anxieties were fueled by the need for premature conclusions. Now, not knowing becomes tolerable, even fertile. From this place, intuition grows more refined. It is no longer reactive. It does not shout. It whispers. And the person has learned how to listen. Listening, here, is not effort. It is receptivity. Jung saw receptivity as a feminine quality of the psyche that modern individuals often suppress. When it is restored, life feels less combative. The person stops forcing alignment and begins recognizing it. They notice when something fits and when it does not. Not intellectually, but somatically. The body becomes a compass. A subtle contraction signals misalignment. A quiet ease signals truth. These signals are not always comfortable, but they are consistent. Trust in them grows slowly. As trust grows, choices become simpler. Not easier, but clearer. The person stops negotiating with what they already know internally. This does not make them rigid. It makes them sincere. Sincerity replaces performance. And performance was exhausting. Without the need to perform, energy is conserved. This energy flows into presence, into listening, into engagement that feels clean rather than compulsive. Jung believed that when psychic energy is no longer wasted, the individual naturally moves toward what is meaningful. Meaning is not imposed from outside. It emerges from resonance. The person may not yet see the full shape of their path, but they feel its direction. And direction, even without a map, is enough to continue. Life continues to present complexity. Contradictions do not vanish, but the person no longer feels lost inside them. They are accompanied by an inner steadiness that does not promise certainty, only honesty, and that honesty becomes the quiet thread, guiding each next step, even as the unfolding remains open, alive, and unresolved in the most human sense. With this honesty as an inner thread, the person begins to recognize how much of life was once lived in anticipation rather than presence. Waiting for clarity, waiting for certainty, waiting for permission. Jung understood that waiting, when unconscious, becomes paralysis. But when waiting is conscious, it becomes listening. The person no longer suspends their life until answers arrive. They move gently forward, even while questions remain. This movement is subtle, often invisible to others. Externally, little may seem to change. Internally, everything reorganizes. The person notices that they are no longer driven by the need to resolve the past. Memories arise, but they no longer demand explanation or redemption. The past is seen as a landscape that shaped the psyche, not a courtroom that must deliver a verdict. This shift releases tremendous energy. Jung believed that when guilt and rumination lose their grip, the psyche naturally turns toward the future, not as fantasy, but as possibility. Possibility feels different from hope. Hope depends on outcomes. Possibility depends on openness. The person becomes open again, not naively, not defenselessly, but open in a grounded way. They can meet new experiences without immediately filtering them through old wounds. This does not mean the wounds are gone. It means they are no longer in charge. The psyche has recentered. From this center, the person becomes more attuned to meaning rather than intensity. They notice what nourishes them over time, not just what excites them briefly. This discernment reshapes priorities. Certain ambitions quietly lose importance. Certain values gain weight, not because they are morally superior, but because they resonate more deeply. Jung saw values as expressions of the self. Once the ego stops chasing substitutes, life becomes simpler in unexpected ways. There are fewer internal negotiations, fewer justifications, fewer inner arguments. Decisions still carry consequences, but they no longer fracture the self. Even regret, when it appears, is held with compassion rather than judgment. The person understands now that growth is rarely linear. There are returns, repetitions, moments of doubt, but these no longer feel like failure. They feel like reminders. Reminders to come back to the inner ground that has proven reliable, not because it offers comfort, but because it offers truth. And truth, even when quiet, has a stabilizing power. From here, life continues to unfold, not as something to master, but as something to meet, again and again, with increasing presence, integrity, and a growing trust in the slow intelligence of the psyche itself. As this trust in the psyche's slow intelligence deepens, the person begins to notice how their relationship with effort becomes more refined. They no longer confuse force with commitment. Jung observed that when the ego is no longer anxious about control, action arises more organically. The person still acts, still chooses, still engages, but without the internal pressure to justify every step. There is less self-surveillance, less inner commentary. Moments are lived more directly. This directness brings a new sensitivity. The person becomes aware of subtle shifts in mood, energy, and motivation. They notice when something is being done out of habit, rather than meaning. And instead of judging this, they adjust. This adjustment is gentle. Jung believed that psychological health is not rigidity, but adaptability rooted in a stable center. The person begins to feel that center more clearly. It does not demand attention. It does not assert itself loudly. It simply remains. When confusion arises, they return inward, not to isolate, but to orient. This inward orientation shortens recovery time after emotional disturbances. Disappointment still stings, but it no longer lingers as long. Conflict still unsettles, but it no longer destabilizes the whole inner structure. The psyche has learned how to self-regulate. This regulation is not suppression. It is circulation. Feelings move through awareness, instead of accumulating. The person also becomes more realistic about their limits. They no longer promise what they cannot sustain. They no longer overextend to avoid guilt. Jung emphasized that respecting one's limits is an act of psychic integrity. From this integrity, self-respect grows. Not inflated, not performative, quiet. And this quiet self-respect subtly alters how others respond. The person is treated with more clarity. Boundaries are sensed rather than tested. Not always, but often enough to feel the difference. Life continues to present uncertainty, But uncertainty no longer equals instability. It becomes part of the terrain. The person walks without demanding certainty, without denying vulnerability, without abandoning themselves when the path becomes unclear. And in this way, healing continues, not as an event, not as a destination, but as a living relationship with one's own inner truth that keeps unfolding with patience, attention, and an ever-deepening sense of inner coherence. This is why Carl Jung understood healing not as a moment of resolution, but as a return to inner coherence. Healing begins when you stop explaining yourself to the world and start listening to what remains when the noise falls away. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It does not seek validation. It begins in silence, in the decision to no longer abandon yourself for understanding, approval, or certainty. When you choose yourself, you are not turning away from life. You are finally meeting it from a place of truth. And from that place, the psyche reorganizes. Energy returns. Meaning emerges. Life begins to feel inhabitable again. Not perfect, not painless, but honest. Jung believed that when a person lives in alignment with their inner truth, the soul no longer needs to scream through symptoms. It can speak quietly, through intuition, presence, and integrity. If this reflection resonated with you, if it put words to something you have felt but could not explain, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here, we explore Carl Jung's insights, depth psychology, and the unseen processes that guide healing, identity, and transformation. Subscribe, and continue this journey inward, where real change always begins.